All right, well, I apologize. I don't want to delay any further, but we can't get this wireless mic working. So when we get to that part of the evening, if anyone has trouble hearing a question, what I'll do is I'll repeat it so that everyone has the opportunity to hear the question that's being asked. So thank you, everyone, for coming this evening. We appreciate it. I'm going to start by introducing my team. I went too far. My name is Paul Lippens. I'm a vice president and project manager with McKenna. McKenna is a planning and urban design firm. We work all over the Midwest, and we're happy to be here in Zionsville working with the community this week on a very important project to update the town code or the town zoning code. So for a little bit of context, I've been sharing with people that very early in my career, I was able to live in Broad Ripple actually for 3 years and work on a number of projects that were really formed the basis of my understanding of planning and design. And it's just been a real pleasure for me to be back here, spending time in this community again and having the opportunity to work with everybody. My team is here, and I'm going to let everyone introduce themselves. So why don't you guys just briefly, and Adam, will you do the charrette intro again? I know you've done it, and I rely on you to do this, but I think it's helpful for people.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Adam Cook. I'm a planning consultant with McKenna. I've been working a lot on the sort of urban design and especially the public engagement portions of our charrette. And I'm going to do a little quick show of hands, one of a few we're going to do this evening. How many people have heard that word before, charrette? Oh, wow. You are the best group so far. I mean, that's almost like 50%. But I don't want to leave the other 50% hanging, so I'm going to explain what a charrette is. In a sense, I may be standing at one. It's a French word, and it's a French word that means little cart. So really, it's more like a little push cart, that you would push around a room. And they used these back about 100, 140, 150 years ago at an art school in France called the Académie des Beaux-Arts, okay? And what would happen is the design students and the architecture students and so on and so forth would create these projects, kind of like their semester projects or their term projects. And they would be procrastinating and working furiously and very creatively right up until that deadline when they were collected and taken to their professors to grade them, okay? And a docent or an assistant would come around with one of these little charrettes, one of these little push carts, and somebody drew a picture of this happening, right? And what you're seeing is all of these design projects loaded up onto this cart, and the students are following along with their pens and their pencils, making small refinements and adjustments all the way until, by last minute, that's the definition of last minute, right until that cart was pushed into the jury room. So why do we use that word for what we're doing here today? We've become, familiar with that term charrette. We use it to describe a planning process or a design process that's very thorough, very intense, and also embedded. So we've embedded ourselves, kind of like a residency, in the community this entire week. We're spending our entire days meeting with town staff, meeting with core stakeholders, and meeting with the general public as well. So we've had events every evening this week, as well as in the mornings and the afternoons. So we're constantly getting your feedback, we're constantly getting your input, and at the same time, we're working and refining our very, very first rough draft of what will ultimately become the town code. But it's a very creative process, and that's why we use that word to describe it. So, Paul.
Hi, my name is Danielle Bouchard. I'm a senior planner with McKenna. I'll be helping out the project in various different aspects. Most notably, I've been working on a lot of the mapping so far. We're pleased to be here tonight, and thank you for coming.
My name is Michael Campbell. I'm the architect on the team, and I'll be undertaking 2 roles. One of those is to be developing building types for the form-based code, and the other is helping you develop a consensus vision for the rural areas of the city, which are the townships. Thank you.
All right, well, it always helps to start with introductions. I'm not going to introduce everyone in the evening or in the room this evening from the town administration, but maybe by show of hands, could everyone who works for the town maybe just give a hand so the residents that are here can see you? And we do have the town planning staff here, and I'm sure they would be very gracious about talking to everyone when we get to the discussion portion of the evening as well. So I'm going to do one more show of hands as we get in. Part of the first 3 days of this was targeted to do a little bit of geographic outreach. So we went to the western portion of the town in Perry Township, historic Perry Township, the northern portion of the town, Union and Worth Township. And then this is designed to really target the central portion of the town, Eagle Township, and the village. And our event tomorrow is going to be more of a summarized, we're going to work to summarize kind of what we've heard all week. We are adding a little bit of what we've learned into our daily presentation, but if you've been here before, it's going to be similar to what you've seen on the other nights as well. But I do want to do a show of hands. Is there anyone here from the township, from Eagle Township? All right, a couple people. Is there anyone here tonight from the village? All right, great. We've got a lot of village residents here tonight. Anyone coming again from Perry? All right, thank you. And is there anyone from Union or Worth? Wonderful. Okay, well, thank you. For folks that are joining us again, we really appreciate your involvement, and we're looking forward to continue our conversations. And if you're here for the first time, thank you for sharing some of your time with us this week. We talk about zoning. Zoning is not the funnest topic, right? But it's a very important topic in planning, because while you have a comprehensive plan that helps to set a futuristic vision, how the town wants to grow in 20, 30 years, the zoning ordinance is tied to that vision. It's designed to create that vision, but it's designed to start creating it today. So we're working on regulations and standards that, when the town adopts them, will become the effective development regulations for the town. So it's an interesting project, even though it can be a little dry talking about standards. We really have the ability to fix and to modify some of what the development patterns and design patterns that appear in the town. We have the ability to modify and correct some of those in the near term. And I think that's really exciting. It's part of what makes this project really interesting. And we're calling this a little bit of a reorganized coding effort, because part of Zionsville, since it is an amalgamation of several historic different jurisdictions, what the code is, what the zoning code is now, is a little bit of just taking the codes from these areas and combining them without ever really eliminating redundancies or even conflicting regulations. So what our hope is to do, primarily is to simplify the code, to think really about what the purpose of the code is, and to preserve the codes that created the regulations that created this code, preserve the development regulations that make Zionsville an important place, but also to eliminate some of the redundancies and what makes the code confusing and hard to deal with. I sometimes use a planning term when I talk about this, and it's a fun word. I call it disambiguation, right? So the code is very ambiguous. What we want to do is a disambiguation process, which is a long and jumbled way of saying we want to just clarify the purpose and the regulations in the town. So one of the things about our firm that we really like is places like Zionsville that are experiencing rapid growth and have issues of wanting to respond to economic incentives and find great places for that growth, to grow the tax base, to create a high quality of life for residents, but also have very valuable things to preserve. And this boundary between the urban edge and the rural area is where I think a lot of the most interesting things are happening in planning, and it's happening right here in your community. And I think what Zionsville has done is created a platform to do a very excellent growth management code that also defines how the places you want to grow can grow effectively and grow in a manner that residents will appreciate and will be attached to the preferences we hear. I like to show this picture. This is General Store. It's actually an antique shop now, but this is the Dixboro General Store. This is right across from the church in the village I grew up in, outside of Ann Arbor. And what I like about it is it shows urbanism, but urbanism in a rural form, right? And when you get to this general store, it doesn't make you feel like you're in a city. It maintains that historic character of a village. And there are many places in the town that have this, whether it's in a pristine condition or maybe in a little bit of a tired and need a remodel. There are lots of places like this that have the benefits of maintaining some of that rural character, but have the good bones to build on. And juxtaposing this is another place that I lived way back when I was in college in New York City. And the elements of urbanism are transparent and you can visualize them in both of these photos. So in both of these photos, you'll see that both of these buildings are at the lot line, so they're walkable. They're designed to be accessed by pedestrians. They relate to the transportation system, so they're at a traffic light or on a prominent intersection. There are multiple stories, right? So they're mixed uses. You have an upstairs and a downstairs use. In the general store, often the person who operated the store would live in that building. And they also have ground floor transparency, so you can see through the windows, you can see it's a safe space. Those punched openings, some of those architectural details. And the awnings, we did some walking today and we took shelter under some of the awnings in the village to get out of the rain. These are important things that represent urbanism, but also represent a rural town center. And those types of things can be coded in a way that makes places effective in all those contexts. I think it's also important to note that even in that suburban context, the interstitial area between a town center or even a statewide center like Indianapolis, there's lots of areas that develop according to kind of suburban principles. And that can be done really well, and there are many examples in this region of really good suburban style development. There's also some examples of suburban development that I wouldn't say it's bad, but I would say it doesn't preserve architecture or agricultural character. And I think those places are great, but that's not what we've heard the town of Zionsville residents really want. So how do you achieve this in zoning? You really have to focus on having good architectural standards and creating standards that are designed to control form. And when we talk about form-based codes, what we're talking about is creating a town code that's organized around form as a principle of development. So we want to understand what types of places people want to see built, the character of those places, and then define where they should go and what types of standards should be attached to them. And architectural design details can go into, for instance, sign location, sign size, but also some of those elements and features I was talking about, regulating the size of the windows to ensure transparency, regulating the doors, window placement. I think Mike is going to talk a little bit more about this. But what we've been working in this week is to understand where those precedents are. So where in the community are the places that Zionsville residents most like, most value, and cherish and want to preserve. Our opportunity in understanding those places is to create or understand those precedents and create standards that will make sure that future development replicates those really good places, those really good designs, the best of the community. We want new development to complement those aspects. I think the other thing that we look at in doing this is to understand the form of the community. So from the historic village to some of the regional historic hamlets or other places, smaller towns, how they relate to each other from the vehicle network, from neighborhoods, how do neighborhoods access those places, and how do the corridors relate to those places. And that's an important part of developing the regulation. Another kind of important thing that can be included in a form-based code is the idea of having a concept plan and a regulating plan. So on the left is something that we would call more of a concept plan, and that is actually a plan that shows the building placement and the road placement and how they relate to the surrounding neighborhoods. With a concept plan, you can actually require that future development be built exactly as shown on a concept plan. On the right is kind of a generalized version of that. So the regulating plan is similar to a zoning map, and it defines districts or character areas. When you look at a regulating plan for a form-based area, you'll usually see the colors of those zones represented in a dark lavender being kind of the center of the place or the more intense area of that place. And then the lighter shades of lavender showing the neighborhoods around them. And as opposed to a conventional ordinance, which is kind of brighter primary colors. But those districts, the lavender to the lighter lavender, the darker violet to the lighter lavender, illustrate this broader idea of a transect. So at the center of the place is the more intense, or sometimes I call it the high place, or the place in the area where it's most desirable to be. And I think in Zionsville, that really is the village. It doesn't mean that the village is going to be the most intensely developed place, but it is the place that is the heart and soul of the community. And other places in the town that develop, I think, will be developed in reference to how the village looks. So that would kind of be the center of the transect for Zionsville. And then what we need to define is how that transect develops throughout the town to other potential new centers. And then also, I think what is really important is this area here, is the rural context. And I think that in order to have a community that really preserves the rural context, we have to understand the types of forms of development that appear in those areas and how to best guide them. So a form-based code is a conventional to a traditional or conventional, or an alternative to a traditional or conventional zoning code. So as we consolidate and look to revise the code, what we want to do is look for opportunities to create more form-based regulations that are tied to design and create a predictable standard and a predictable high-quality public realm. In this way, form-based codes can be used to reverse trends that have resulted from a traditional suburban style zoning code. But they can also make spaces for people to actually live a lifestyle where they can walk, eat, shop very close to their home. The idea that services should be placed in a close, livable proximity to the place where people actually live. And as we move forward, I think people are currently looking more and more to live in places like this, which is part of the reason why people are moving to the town of Zionsville, because you offer walkability, you offer places where these services are. And that's one of the things that makes this community a desirable place to live. So again, the conventional zoning approach really focuses more on uses, understanding what uses are permitted, and then just saying, hey, in this area, you can do all of these uses. In this area, you can do all of these uses. There are dimensional standards in your code now, and conventional zoning does regulate lot size, setbacks, building height. All of those elements of design are in a code. They're just not easy to access. So what we're going to do is we're going to take those regulations, we're going to test them, make sure that they actually make sense on the lots and the places that exist, and then we're going to make it easy to understand. So even if things don't change, which I think a lot of this will be a consolidation. I don't think we're going to change much when it comes down to it. We're going to look at what those rules are, then we're going to make them easier to understand. Sometimes we call that a consolidation of regulations, but putting those setbacks, the height, all of those regulations or dimensional standards into easy to understand tables, so that if you want to know the rules that apply to your property or your place of business, it'll be easier to find and access them in this code. So form-based codes, they contain this regulating plan. They focus on district characters, and as I mentioned, the darker shades represent the center of the area, with more of the residential neighborhoods being on the center. I think part of this approach too is understanding that within those neighborhoods, allowing for some services, churches or faith-based organizations, these things exist in neighborhoods, but people think of single-family neighborhoods as only allowing single-family. And that's just not always the case. In some cases, that is appropriate. In some cases, though, having some services located near residential neighborhoods is really highly desirable. I think one of the other things we'd like to point out about form-based codes that's very interesting is that it allows us to actually regulate use vertically. So we can create building types that define the types of buildings, and then we can require, for instance, retail to be located on the first floor. We can permit office on the second floor, but we could require a residential use on the third floor. And in that way, we can actually do more to determine what types of uses are in a district, even within the buildings that go there. In addition to that, the form-based codes can and often do regulate street types, require connections like pedestrian connections, bicycle parking. And I think it's important to note too that if you can develop a consensus vision on the quality and type of development that goes in an area, that you can also streamline the development process. So in a sense, if the community can agree on the quality of development that should occur, you can make those development decisions easier on your town representatives. And this is by making sure that development is required to match a pre-existing concept. So basically, you do the planning work up front. That makes it easier for everybody to understand and assess the community as it goes through different site design processes. So I think it's very important for you all to know that you are here right up the front of this process. It doesn't work. This is really a policy project, and you can't do a policy project without actually working with the people who influence and are affected by the policy. So we did some analysis to understand the community and what the regulations were that were in place in advance of coming for this shred process. But the shred is really up front in this process. So we can't really develop recommendations until we hear from people, hear from the community, and understand what those preferences are. Because those preferences are what are going to form the basis of our recommendations. Following the week we spend here, we're going to work on drafting a code, and that really does take a little bit of time. There will be some time where we're going to need to work through what we've heard and develop recommendations that we feel align with what we heard from representative stakeholders who we talked to this week. But following that, we'll look for technical feedback from the town administration and from other collaborators in the process. And then we'll create a final draft. And all through, I should mention this now because you've been mentioning it again. There's a website called ZionsvilleTownCode.com. We will be posting updates throughout this process, and we did add an email button to that website, so you can submit your email through that. We're going to generate an email list so that we can keep people informed as we work through the process. But back to the schedule here. After the final draft, we're going to work with the town on public hearings. So that's another opportunity for the public to give feedback on that draft. And then only after that whole process would the town consider the adoption. I think the other thing that's important to note is that even when a zoning ordinance is adopted, it can be amended, right? So if there's something that we wind up recommending through this process that turns out it doesn't work, that's okay. Oftentimes you amend a code to match the community. But what happens is if we can get it right, or even get it close to right, what it does is it will make it so that it will be easier for the town to develop in a manner that is aligned with the preferences of most of the people that we've heard from through this process. So our hope really tonight and in all the meetings we've been doing this week is that we get to understand what those preferences are so we can develop standards that really do reflect what we hear. So that's the intro. I'm going to talk again in a little bit. I'm going to pass it off to my colleague Adam, who is going to share with you a little bit about the history of Zionsville and the analysis that we've done to prepare for this week.
Thank you, Paul. I am tasked with doing the fun part of this presentation. And when I say fun, we're going to get into a little bit of community history. And This is a community that's incredibly knowledgeable about its history. And as a matter of fact, one of the first places I went, the first time I visited, was Sullivan Munts, and started asking questions and getting some good imagery to use throughout this project. The reason we do that is because, it's almost a cliche, but you don't know where you're going, or you can't know where you're going if you don't know where you've been, right? So let's go all the way back to the 1870s, right? 1878, and let's look at Boone County. This is just a portion of a map of Boone County from a plat book from 1878. And one of the things that we do when we look at these old maps is we look at sort of regional form. How did people settle throughout the region? Where were the centers? Well, Lebanon was a center all the way up here in the northwest, but Zionsville was a center all the way down here in the southeast. Of course, Zionsville, as we know, was founded to take advantage of sort of being equidistant between Lebanon and Indianapolis to the south. But we can see a number of other settlements on here as well, right? We can see Whitestown, the sort of Whitestown village, as it were. We can see Fayette, where we had the pleasure of presenting 2 nights ago. We see a little hamlet settlement. We're going to start using the word hamlet a little bit in this talk tonight, called Northfield. And just about 2 miles north of there, this is Michigan Road, or 421, and this is State Road 32 along here. But you can see Ralston up there. And then further out, we've got Hamilton, we've got Eagle Village, the original settlement in the area, and so on and so forth. So even in a predominantly agricultural era, and just kind of the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, where cities were starting to grow around things like railroads, Zionsville was still the original village. When I refer to Zionsville in this period, the original village was still very much situated in a sea of agriculture dotted with small settlements, smaller towns, and little hamlets. And there were actually several others. I mean, you can see Home Station. This dotted line here was a rail line that at that point was proposed, and Gadsden is also a hamlet that still exists today, that's situated right about there along that rail line. So that's kind of the context going all the way back to the earliest development of the village. When we talk about regulating land use, zoning as we know it today is kind of a 20th century invention. Zoning codes really became popular in the 19-teens and 1920s. And there was a Supreme Court case that urban planners know well called Euclid v. Ambler that was settled in the 1920s that determined that zoning, or zoning by use, was a legitimate use of local government's police power. And so once that happened, zoning as a tool for land use regulation then promulgated all the way from coast to coast. Larger cities typically did it first because they had more complex problems to solve. And then towns and villages kind of followed. And then last, more or less, the rural areas and the counties that planned for townships, such as in Indiana, adopted zoning ordinances later into maybe the 50s, 60s, and into the 70s. There are still a handful of communities across the Midwest that are not zoned to this day, but the majority are. But when we look at land use in general, ordinances have been passed all the way in Zionsville going back to 1881. So the first land use ordinance in the village, and perhaps somebody here might correct me if I'm wrong, this is the first one that I could find. It abolished the slaughtering of animals on any property within the town limits. If you go to 1923, a new land use came about due to the motor car, a new technology. And the village had to respond. How do we regulate land uses now that are being created for this new technology? In this case, an oil filling station. And so a permit was issued for that first one in 1923. And you can see that the village's first zoning ordinance was approved just before the start of World War II, approved and adopted November 17th, 1941. And then the Plan Commission was seated in 1952, and you can see some other milestones in Zionsville's planning and zoning history all the way up until sort of the more modern era of the 1980s and beyond. Now, if we go back to that old era, that railroad era of Zionsville, I've got this is from about that same, I believe that same 1878 plat book. Wayne was kind enough, if after our presentation tonight, take a look at the blue document in the frame on the leaning up against the right-hand side wall. That's a plat from, I believe, 1923 or 1924 that shows the town in a little bit of a future state of growth. But what we see is how the town had grown up until that point. So really the first 20 or 30 years of Zionsville as a village. And this is what it looked like. As most of us know, we have the main rail line running along what is now First Street. What's called South Street on this plat is now Oak Street, or many people know it as 334, even though it's no longer officially 334. And right about here would be what we know as Lincoln Park, which is of course where President Lincoln gave his sort of whistle stop speech. What we see is that you've got the original plat in yellow, and you can see that there's a block structure, there's a pattern. William Zion, the town founder, and his partners used a very conventional method for these railroad towns of platting in terms of street dimensions, in terms of lot dimensions. But once the town started outgrowing this original plat, additional speculators came in. So you can see Cross's fourth edition here over to the west. You can see Oliver's edition. And you can see Cross's, I believe that's second or maybe third edition. What's interesting about Mr. Cross is that he didn't use the greatest surveyor in the world. And so what happened is these two plats don't line up exactly. If you're wondering why there's that really interesting jog there on Main Street at Oak Street, that's why. You had the original part of the town to the south, you had this addition to the north, and the surveying didn't match up. They didn't have maybe equipment with the same level of accuracy that we do today. As a matter of fact, in 1870 something, the town actually purchased a little plot of land on one of these four corners to kind of straighten that main street out to make it a little bit easier for, at the time, people on foot, people on bikes, people on horses, to negotiate that. And so, well, on paper, that looks like, oh man, someone really screwed up, someone made a mistake. In reality, what did that do? That created that postcard view. That postcard view makes Zionsville the place that it is. This is the picture that everybody sees. This is the picture that makes it sort of the pride of Indiana in terms of historic communities. And that wasn't done on purpose. That was a happy accident. If any of you are familiar with Bob Ross, he liked to use that phrase in painting. But in urbanism, in the growth of cities, the development, the long history of cities and urban design, we talk about happy accidents too. You know, we can't design necessarily these things in. People are people, people are imperfect, and as long as they're working within sort of the broad pattern. So when we think of the broad patterns that were going on when these additions were added to the town, they generally followed that pattern. Little happy accidents happened, and those things kind of added up to create a really unique, one-of-a-kind place. And you can see some other things that are sort of antecedent from that. We're looking down First Street in these pictures. And of course, this is the former railroad right-of-way, as I mentioned. We call these edge conditions. You know, just one block away is Main Street, right? That's front of house, right? When we think of restaurants, I'm sure some of you have worked in the service industry. All of us eat in restaurants. And restaurants talk about front of house and they talk about back of house, right? You go in, you get seated. There's a really nice looking bar. There's nice clean tables. That's front of house. And then you go back of house and it's chaos back there, right? It's busy. It's where the cooks are cooking and servers are, and food runners are running in and out. And it's a totally different world. Or, you know, if you haven't worked in that industry, like I haven't worked in that industry, you like Gordon Ramsay, you know, watch one of those restaurant shows that he does. And you can see the difference. You know, Gordon Ramsay is, you know, Mr. Smooth front of house, and then back of house, he's a totally different beast, right? I'm not trying to compare First Street to Gordon Ramsay in a direct way. But what I'm saying is the back of the house in Zionsville is just as important as the front of the house. This is where all the action happens. When we've been observing the town, just like other towns, during the day, we've got activity working on Main Street, people greeting each other, people promenading, taking walks, looking in the windows, doing their shopping. But the real action is happening back here. People are parking in perpendicular manners to some of these back doors to load and unload. In this case, we've got this great little pizzeria back here that's actually serving customers. And it's convenient because it's facing the park and it's facing residential. So it's a little bit more convenient for some people. Of course, you've got your utility poles. You've got all sorts of cool stuff happening. This is the stuff that makes the town work. This is like taking your beautiful car and then, you know, opening up the hood and taking a look at the motor and all of the stuff that makes it work. So we have these unique conditions where 1 block away from this main street, we've got a mix of land uses, we've got some former industrial uses, and just a wide variety of things. And we would say this gives this area its charm, right? Because it is a working community. It's a real community. It's an authentic community. It looks great on a postcard, but it isn't Main Street Disneyland. It's a real place. It's an authentic place. And so a lot of things that have led to this happening today in 2021 are things from a policy perspective that have worked really well. And we love the phrase, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. So, in this undertaking for the town code, we want to make sure we are not unnecessarily fixing something that doesn't need fixing. Rather, again, to use Paul's words, we want to just make sure that it's from a town-wide perspective, an easy to use and easy to understand document. Just a little bit more history. We've got a wide range of transportation choices that Zionsville, or transportation eras that Zionsville has played an active part in. Of course, the interurban tracks going down Main Street. Here you see just a segment of a map of the Midwestern interurban network in right around, I believe, 1915 or so. If you were to zoom this map out and go about over here, you'd see Columbus, Ohio. And my great-grandfather was actually a conductor on the interurban line between Columbus and Delaware, one town north. So there's a little bit of a history of that in my family, but you can also see just how many places you can get to from Zionsville on the interurban. Lafayette and Terre Haute and Muncie. For a lot of these longer trips, you would be taking conventional passenger rail. This would take a lot longer. But for smaller trips within the region, the interurban was absolutely the way to go for about 30 years. And of course, there's your legacy. Legacy both in the street, the bricks on the street itself, as well as the buildings that developed around that time. Most of Main Street's iconic commercial buildings really did develop during that interurban period. What we think of as, your traditional shopfront building, your brick 2-story shopfront below and potentially an apartment above. Now we get into the automobile era. This is where things started changing, not just in Zionsville, not just in Indiana, but from coast to coast. To accommodate the automobile, right, we had massive change in how we thought about planning and design and zoning. Some people call it modernism. And that was where it became really important in those years for people to separate uses, to accommodate as much traffic as possible, moving as efficiently as possible. And that's how we got the interstate highway system. And so Zionsville here is in 1956. And in just a few years, you would have Interstate 465 coming in right down here and Interstate 65 coming in right down here. And that, of course, spurred this larger pattern of regional growth that's continuing and just booming today. The other thing that Zionsville did, they made an incredible decision. Your parents, your grandparents, the previous generations that have handed the town off to you to take care of, made some great decisions. Now, this is an interesting building. We talked about these a little bit this afternoon. This is a colonial, what we call is it neo-colonial, Mike? Colonial revival, thank you. It's a colonial revival building. They made two very important decisions. One was to focus on preservation, historic preservation of many of the existing Main Street commercial structures. Many other towns in the region, as we know, didn't do that, and they lost a great legacy in those years, 1950s through the 70s. At the same time, new development was typically done in this colonial revival style, which now, in and of itself, is a historic style, but it's very different. And it's not a style that was really endemic to Zionsville or to a lot of places in the region. And so it's very interesting kind of juxtaposition, because these buildings, we kind of feel like they fit in a way, but at the same time, they present a marked contrast to what we see on the main street. In other news during those years, we had more of a suburban style of development come in. And Boone Village really isn't anything compared to what we're seeing out in Westfield and out in Whitestown in terms of, if you think of the new Meyer stores and the new big box stores that are getting built out there. Boone Village operates the same way. It's just a little bit smaller because it's an early example. It's designed for primary access by somebody in a car rather than somebody on foot. Although, yes, you can walk there if you want. It's just not principally designed for that. And in this case, deer can access that as well. We saw a story about that deer stocking up on toilet paper at Kroger last year. But there's an example of sort of the suburban style of development coming in fairly close to where the historic village is. And that node there around, I believe it's Ford and Oak Street, has kind of developed out in that 70s, 80s scale of suburban development. And that's one of the questions that we have too in terms of the future is this style of development something that's going to continue on for the next 30 or 40 years? Or are we kind of at the precipice of change at this point in 2021? Now, this is the fun part. I want to take a look really quickly because I want to be respectful of your time, but we've got some aerial photos here. We're going to start with 1955. And the next three are, we're going forward about 25 or 15 years ahead in time. So we're going to take some jumps ahead in time. We start in 1955. Down here, we've got Zionsville Village. You can see Oak Street or 334 kind of coming out here to the west. Over here, cutting the corner, we've got 421 or Michigan Road. We've got the rail line coming out here. And what we see, right, is still that pretty much untouched, concentrated pattern of development in the village. The village had had more of those platted additions by the mid-1950s, but it's completely surrounded in Worth Township, in Union Township, in Eagle Township, and then, of course, in Perry Township by, like I said, that same pattern we saw in the first map. So pristine agricultural land dotted with little settlements and hamlets. And so this aerial doesn't go far enough to show Northfield or Fayette, some of the other hamlets, but trust me, they're there. The other thing that we see is that these parcels are pretty much unsplit. They're still actively farmed. In some cases, they're for orchard use. In some cases, they've been grown with trees or forests. But for the most part, they're actively farmed. And they haven't been split off into smaller subparcels. Now, when we move up to 1981, what we can see is that suburban pattern, right? We can see out here in Eagle some of the first, what we would think of today as conventional subdivisions. Houses more spread out, individual yards, looping streets that don't necessarily connect, lots of cul-de-sacs. We can see a number of them under construction. And the other thing that we see in this pattern is some of these rural lot splits happening. Where the character is staying rural, it is still staying agricultural because predominantly, in terms of acreage, the use is predominantly agricultural. However, we're starting to see some of these lots get split off for that kind of large lot, rural residential use. That's just a different lifestyle. It's a different lifestyle. Somebody who lives here has a little bit of a different lifestyle than somebody who lives here. Neither of them want to farm or wish to farm or depend on that for their income necessarily. But up here, you have the ability to have horses, you have the ability to have more vehicles, and like I said, it's a different lifestyle choice. But the context of this area is still staying predominantly agricultural. Now we're going to move up to 2005. So I'll do this a couple of times just because it's really instructive to look. When we get to 2005, again, we see further development of this tissue. Sometimes we want to be really fancy, we call it dendritic. But the suburban residential tissue, we see the beginnings of Stonegate, which is kind of a response to that, which is sort of a new town concept, which is a lot more traditional, kind of self-contained town with a village green and a little bit of a main street. You can see that it was just getting underway back in 2005. You can see further lot splits off of these, especially these parcels getting further north into Union, where the land, the topography is a lot more of a rolling topography, for example. And that's where you're seeing a lot of this pattern. And then we move up to 20, I don't know why that got blurry all of a sudden, but we move up to 2020, and again, this is what we look like today. And some of the major changes here, this is out in Whitestown. So you can see sort of the development along there of Whitestown Parkway, more very conventional suburban development along the parkway, but also some multifamily and some walkable neighborhoods back there too, even though none of it really connects to each other. That's an issue not because it's in Zionsville's zoning jurisdiction, but because it sits in between Zionsville and Union and Worth and Perry. And so we have to look at it, we have to take into account when we're looking at these sort of regional trends of growth that are really influencing the land use decisions that Zionsville, that the town will be making going forward. So this is the current era. We're in the reorganization era, like I said, Perry, Eagle, Worth, Union, and the Village all coming together. Again, these are just ground level photos from our surveys of the things I've just shown you on the aerial photograph. 4 different residential subdivisions, 2020s. This is about 1990s or 2000s, 1990s or 80s, and back into the 70s. So we have a zoning code that takes into account a bunch of evolving residential development standards, but effectively has been creating the same thing for 40 years. We look at some changes that are happening in the village itself. We look at some new builds, look at older houses being torn down and replaced by newer houses. And some of these newer houses have been given variances. I'm not sure exactly. We didn't talk about this one specifically today, but you can see that there are certain design elements that may be up for question in terms of how big these houses are, massing, where the garage is located, the amount of impervious surface that's included. These are all things that have been brought to our attention when we're talking about development patterns in the village. But it's not to say that everything's bad. Here's an example of a rehab of a historic home. And thanks to the magic of Google Street View, we can go back in time and look at these parcels now almost year by year. And so we can see the difference from 2007 to 2019. Here's just another example of what we've been talking about. The 1940s, 1950s, 1960s era smaller homes, bungalow-style homes getting replaced with things that in certain aspects look a lot more traditional in form, in other aspects look a lot more modern in design, and again, may be a little bit taller than what people on this street might have been accustomed to previously. But we're not just looking at the village. The town is a large area geographically. It's a very diverse area, and we've been looking at sort of the hamlets that we talked about going back to the beginning of my slides, right? We looked at Fayette, we looked at Ralston, we looked at Gadsden, and have studied the form there too, and have been talking all week about how people in the more rural areas would like to see growth directed in those areas. So when we talk about the zoning, there's been urban-rural boundary drawn on our maps for ever since the sort of consolidation occurred. And rural-urban means a number of different things, right? There are tax implications, there are fire implications, utility implications. And up until now, just due to the nature of how this existing zoning ordinance came together, there are zoning implications. What we want to do as part of the streamlining process to make it a much easier document for the town is to get rid of those urban and rural classifications, but those are just on paper. We want to keep the spirit of the code. But that urban-rural line, that boundary is still going to be on the map. And so what does it mean? This is more of a philosophical question. You know, we're looking out here at one of the newer streets, ending in what's still agricultural land. The question is, you know, how can we use this as a tool to shape those regional growth patterns and really know where our future is and what we're determining, how we're determining our future. So I've mentioned Stonegate. When we're talking about these regional growth patterns, again, you're very familiar with Whitestown and Westfield, and those are just some examples of what we see both to the south, both to the center, and I don't have a photograph of Brownsburg or the Reagan Parkway, but we can also talk about to the south as well. And so again, I always get to the slide a little bit too late when, again, the coming era, really the choice is in your hands when it comes to future land use decisions, zoning decisions. Like I said, the beautiful place that you inhabit today really is a product of the previous generations. Many of you have lived here for just part of many generations. And those of you that are newer here, you are probably the first. You know, hopefully your children and your grandchildren stay. And so, you know, this is just a waypoint on that timeline between the distant past and the distant future. And I really see it as one of the reasons I do what I do, is to help people, you know, make that choice and hand a, you know, quality, lovable place down to the succeeding generations. So I will go and hand it off to Mike, who's going to talk a little bit more about the rural character aspects of this. Thank you.
Thanks, Adam. As I mentioned earlier, one of my roles is to help you develop a consensus vision for the rural areas of the township, or of the city, which are the townships. So that includes Perry, Union, and Eagle Township. Perry's off, indicated in beige to the west. The beige color incidentally indicates agricultural zoning. It's a designation that's current. Union Township to the north, and then Eagle Township is sort of the space between Whitestown and the historic village, which is zoned mostly residential. That's why it's not beige. Conventionally, these areas are built out first with residential, and conventionally that's large lot, single family residential, built more or less wall to wall. They fill out the site with lots. So if you have 1 acre zoning for 1 unit per acre on a 40 acre parcel, you get 40 units or close to it. And then that is followed by this, which is commercial development, shopping centers, because services traditionally follow residential development, and then it's no longer rural. Okay, so you have agricultural land that gets developed as housing, and then you have these shopping centers. What we would like to propose instead is a vision for new hamlets set within an existing rural landscape, looking something like this. And back to the same example, except now you can see what the hamlet would look like in plan, as opposed to being developed out, wall to wall with large lots. You have smaller lots, 66 by 132. It happens to equal 0.2 acres. And you concentrate those lots into one part of the site, and you're able to preserve a substantial amount of agricultural land. And the preservation of that agricultural land combined with the smaller scale of the buildings and the development helps to define a more rural character, or is consistent with your current rural character. So this image shows 40 lots. So if you were to concentrate that 40 lots I showed in the earlier image, you get this result. But actually the agricultural land in Zionsville, that designation is developable as 1 unit per 2 acres. So you'd only get 20 lots, and that preserves considerably more open space, or more, which could be active agricultural land or could be recreational, put to recreational use, depending on the circumstances and the location. The other thing we'd like to propose is walkable mixed-use developments or towns set within the same rural landscape. So towns being bigger than hamlets have more commercial uses or more retail uses, and also what we call, I guess, multifamily or missing middle housing. They can accommodate more development. A good example of this phenomenon of towns and hamlets set in a rural landscape is west of Stuttgart, Germany. And you can see if you take a 36 or 6 mile by 6 mile area, which is 36 square miles, which is the equivalent of 1 U.S. township, like Perry or Union. You can see that west of Stuttgart, Germany, they fit 9 complete suburban cities and still have predominantly open agricultural land. So it's a development pattern that makes that possible. And the U.S., we generally don't do that. We end up building, we see our townships, we call them having been built out, because all the developable land has been consumed. But they don't do that in Germany. They haven't historically. The other thing you see here is some hamlets. In addition to the 9 complete cities, you see a hamlet like right there. I don't know how many I can see. There's several. I think that, you might call that one right there and there. Where else? Down here, there's a few. So this is what we call rural character, because rural areas are made up of small towns set in a serene rural landscape with numerous hamlets. That's what you find all over Indiana and Michigan, rural areas. I don't know what we lost here. Oh, it's cell phone. This is an American town here. It's not in Germany. This is in Colorado, Crested Butte, Colorado. I like to show this because this image because it shows the town, the kind of towns we're talking about, town centers we're talking about that have retail and residential. It shows that and the rural landscape in the same image. It allows you to appreciate, how the compatible, how essentially what amounts to urbanism, which you have in downtown Zionsville, and what they have here in Crested Butte, Colorado, is really a form of urbanism, and how compatible that is with the wilderness landscape. Think about that, because the suburbs are not. We build the suburbs because we're trying to preserve rural character. We want more green space. We want bigger setbacks. People want their own private lot with acreage, that kind of thing. But that really erodes rural character. Rural character is better preserved with a little dollop of urbanism, set in the landscape. Oh, the other reason we like to show this image is because the two buildings in the middle, the more colorful ones, were developed according to a form-based code that was written in the 1970s. Those buildings were built in the early aughts. Is that how you say it? Has anybody ever decided what to say about it? You can say the teens or the 20s, but they call it the aughts. 2000 and 2001 they were built, but according to a code that was written 25 years earlier in the late 70s. And my brother actually shared an office with, he had a travel company. The architects were right up here. This is a very old building, from the 19th century. They had the architecture firm was located up there. The firm didn't do it on contract. They actually were members of the zoning board. The guys that worked at the firm were members of the town zoning board, and they developed the form-based code to which these buildings were constructed. Oh, and the other interesting anecdote, before these buildings were built, it was a volleyball court, and the architects used to play volleyball in that location. Let's see. So in order to achieve this pattern of development, we need to first identify locations for town development and then reserve the remaining areas for hamlets and preserved agricultural land. Development locations need to be based on access to highways and interchanges, existing rooftops, and existing rail lines if possible. That's because the retail component of these developments needs to have visibility and traffic. It has to have traffic going by and visibility from that traffic in order to be viable. And so we took a stab at that before we came. The end of last week, we came up with this image. We picked 4 locations, 1, 2, 3, and 4 locations for town centers. This is in addition to the hamlets. And one of them was in Fayette. One of them's a small part of Eagle Township that fronts on Whitestone Parkway where all that development is. And it's still there available. There's a sign out there that says available. It's 30 acres of farmland ready for development. Third one was, we've since found out is already into development as a conventional retail shopping center. So we missed out on that one. And the fourth one is just the intersection of 2 major highways. So we picked that. But we've been here for 3 days now and we've learned a few things. So we found out about new proposed Ronald Reagan Parkway that's going to come through roughly like this, east of Fayette. So we're going to have to move that to the east because we want to exploit that traffic and the visibility for the retail because we don't want to build a town center and then have it be boarded up immediately. Also, this one we X'd out because we found out there's a shopping center in development. We had a lot of stakeholders out in Union Township, asking us to move this one north to a former hamlet, Roston. So we're going to transform that hamlet, or propose that hamlet be transformed into a town center sometime in the future. So here's how that looks now. This development was in Fayette. We moved it over here to saddle up to Ronald Reagan Parkway, and then we have 4 moved up to Roston, and we found another one talking to an architect, Chris Lake, and there's a PUD right in this location where I have a 3, if you can see a 3 there, that since 2013 has been approved for a walkable mixed-use development already. I don't know when it'll ever get developed, but so that's our 4 locations. But that's still, this is another night, so if anybody has anything to say about that, we could make more changes. Once the locations have been selected, we have to come to stakeholders like you to identify precedents upon which those are to be based. We assume it's probably going to be downtown, the village downtown Zionsville. Could be Nashville, Indiana, but whatever the case, our design team will go out and measure the streets, the width of the streets, note the type of curb and the height of the curb, width of the sidewalks, the building setbacks, the size of the windows on the ground floor, the size of the windows on the upper floors, percentage of glass in both those locations, the frequency of light fixtures and spacing of light fixtures, the on-street parking, whether there is or isn't on-street parking, whether it's parallel or angle, so that developments that take place according to the code, we'll code them according to that. The developments that take place will then resemble those places that you have selected as the precedents. And this, I guess I did the arrow in the wrong direction. Okay, well Danielle has a few words for you as well. That concludes my segment of the presentation.
Thanks. So we're going to keep this discussion really exciting and move into administrative procedures and standards. So this is, of course, a little bit less exciting than the town history and development types and things like that, but it is important nonetheless. So we did, at the beginning of this process, we went through the current zoning ordinance and we made some recommendations on just initial things that we pulled out, ideas and recommendations of things that we think can be enhanced or adjusted or clarified. There's quite a bit here, but essentially the common theme here is to condense and combine. At this point, we were recommending to combine all of the approval and review related criteria into a new section labeled General Procedures and Related Standards with the following information on there. So that'll dictate your site plan and development plan review process and approval criteria, which will be held by the Planning Commission and town staff. Special exception reviews and approval criteria, PUDs, requirements. Something that has come up quite a bit today is the variance process. So I think that that's something that we're going to definitely take a deeper dive in this process on, how are these variances approved and what criteria do we use to approve them. Additionally, that review also includes amendments, violations, code enforcement procedures, public notice requirements, and things like that. Continuing on the recommendation highlights, we will like to restructure the nonconformity section. Essentially, we would like to include a table of a summary of nonconformity regulations. So that'll be like, for example, if you have an existing structure that might not meet setback regulations and somebody else moves in, and how do you move forward with that type of development that's already there, which we consider legal non-conforming. But classifications of non-conforming uses, types of non-conforming uses, non-conforming single-family uses, changes in tenancy or ownership, which I had alluded to earlier, and non-conforming lots. For the recommendation highlights in regards to development plans, basically the gist of this slide is that we would like to kind of pull out and highlight is that we would like to turn this section of the ordinance into more of a user-friendly, read it at a glance and understand it type of format. As you can see here, we pulled out a table that has been utilized in a different community that we work with quite frequently, but the point here is that we like things to be graphic rich and table rich and things like that, so you can easily find the information that you need. The restructure and the condense of special exception uses, basically the process for those, the public hearings, the action by the BZA, post-approval procedures, expirations, site plans required, the information that needs to be in site plans. So all of this we would kind of like to wrap up in a bow and put it in one spot that's easy to understand, no duplication there, and combine everything to make it very user-friendly. Sorry, I didn't put that slide together, so I was just checking. So as part of this process as well, we went through and we analyzed some variances from 2020 to present. Overall, there are 83 variances approved, 3 denied, 13 of which are related to accessory structures, 1 of which of those was denied, 6 building height, 27 related to setbacks, 13 related to lot requirements, design standard 7, and use variances and structures 20 with 2 denied. Essentially, the important takeaway here is that when you move through a zoning ordinance process, that it is important to take a look at the variances that have been approved and denied within recent history, because then we can start to begin to pick out parts of the ordinance that may not be working for the types of development that people are trying to do, or how lots are typically divided out, or changing times over the last 10, 15, 20 years. And for pertaining to general development regulations, standards that apply to uses in all districts. Here we will also be taking a look at parking and loading, access management, landscaping, screening, signage, which is also something that came up quite a bit today during our walk through the village area, making sure that everything is conforming and uniform and brings out that character that residents and town staff like to see. Additionally, we'll take a look at lighting, accessory structures and uses, fences and walls, encroachments, and exempt structures. So this is kind of just a brief list of all of the things that, in addition to building and site design standards, we're going to also be taking a look at the nitty gritty of all of this stuff as well. And lastly, I think this is lastly, the clarity and simplicity of uses, like has been kind of brought up quite a few times this evening, is that one of the biggest goals of this entire process is to make things clear and simple, and user-friendly, easy to use, easy to understand. So for the usability recommendations for the document itself, we're looking at adding hyperlinks. So if there's a section of the ordinance that you find particularly of interest, then you can jump right to it and not have to scroll through tons and tons of pages of information that's not important to you at that time. Improve headers and readability. Again, that user-friendliness type. Add graphics, as I alluded to earlier. Clarify obsolete text. We like to use the plain English term, where we like to use terms that people who aren't in planning and zoning every day like we are, they can open the zoning ordinance and understand what that's saying. And then update those definitions. There are quite a few definitions in the existing ordinance that may not be applicable to our 2021 world, or there might be definitions in there for terms that are not even used in the entire ordinance. So those are kind of the types of things that we look for to begin that process of eliminating information or eliminating terms that might not be as pertinent to what the new ordinance will say. And then for organization, this is just kind of a general list of what we're looking at for the new zoning ordinance. And I won't have to go through all of this, but this is kind of the direction where we see a lot of the new updated ordinances, where that's going to go. So you have your title, purpose, scope, definitions, districts, schedule regulations right up front. That's the important stuff that a lot of people want to know, with setbacks and heights and lot coverage and things like that. And then it kind of moves a little bit more into the longer sections that are related to landscaping requirements, lighting, signs, things like that.
All right, as you can see, if you've been here before, we did add some content tonight to respond to a lot of the questions we had, particularly the variance, the structure of the ordinance, so you can see as it develops a little bit more. But I did want to take a little bit to cover some of the material we covered for those of you who weren't here at one of our previous meetings. So again, let's come back to the idea of what we're trying to accomplish here. A good zoning ordinance, a zoning ordinance that is based in the community's preferences, give us an opportunity to enhance the existing reality, to make the places that aren't working or aren't as desirable better, and also to make new development more aligned with the vision for the community. To do this, we have to have a good understanding of the market, right? So we, as I think it was Mike said, we're adjusting kind of where we place these new centers or the zoning that might create them to align with the transportation system, to align where we think the market will best support them. That also allows us to preserve more of the areas and have the town develop in a logical way. And this has to reflect the neighborhood goals. So that's why we're having these listening sessions so that we can get into a little bit of discussion with you in a bit and talk about what you came here to talk about. So what have we heard? We talked a lot tonight about preserving rural character. That's because this is what we've heard at these sessions. This is important to residents here. Maintaining green and open space, ensuring diverse quality architecture, protecting residents when commercial and industrial areas come in. We heard that a lot about particularly focusing on industrial uses and some of the impacts of those uses. Creating a more variety in housing options, that's really important. And also more economic variety in housing options. So more affordable options and more diversity for options for where people live. Protecting businesses, being intentional how land is used, and making the code simpler. You've heard that a lot. Some other things we heard today as we start to focus in on the village. New developments should match the existing character. Height limits are very important. We heard 2 stories. We also heard with setbacks. In other words, if the upper stories weren't visible from the street, that you could have a 3rd story or even a 4th if it wasn't visible from the street. We also heard that it's not just the front of the properties that have to have a setback, but it's the rear too. It's every angle. But even allowing for a little bit of step back addresses that market issue of making places actually economically viable. We also heard that part of that height requirement is based on floor-to-floor heights. So if we can control the floor-to-floor heights, we can allow maybe some multiple-story buildings that are also at the correct scale. Mike has some good images that aren't in this presentation, even on for apartment buildings, having, is it the first story is like a half story? Yeah, that's it. The first story is a half story so that you can kind of live. The first floor is below grade, right? So you can have 3 stories but actually match an existing building height. And that's a garden apartment type approach, right? Lot coverage was a big issue. Tear downs, obviously any place that is economically viable, desirable, you have people wanting to renovate, and sometimes the cost of renovation exceeds the cost of building new. But we have to make sure that when people build new, it's aligned with what's already here. So stormwater, drainage, obviously as development comes, stormwater and other types of infrastructure are very important. We've already talked a little bit about variance standards, but part of having good variance standards is making sure that we understand if there are variances that are being granted that are acceptable for the town's development preferences, that we should really code them and make them permitted so that those decisions don't have to be made by the ZBA. They can be made in advance by the community. Blending of housing types, creating ADUs. We heard that ADUs were acceptable if they were designed appropriately with the existing neighborhoods. Additionally, things like duplexes that were designed to appear as one-family housing or upper story apartments. These things, if done in a way that was contextually appropriate, could actually help address some of the housing issues in the town. Emerging uses, short-term rentals, we talked about those. There's other emerging uses. And then parking standards, big issue that we want to confront. I mentioned too, one of our big challenges here is the consolidation of districts. I'm not going to go through all the districts, but what you'll see is when we look at the rural and the rural residential districts, you've got 6 districts here. Many of them allow the similar units per acre. So the actual distinction or the purpose or the difference between these districts is really fairly undistinguishable. And it really, I think, the reason why there are so many districts is because you have multiple codes in one code. So rather than consolidating districts when the jurisdictions were joined, the districts were all brought in. So what we want to do is preserve the intent of those districts, preserve the standards in those districts, but also let's call an apple and an orange. But if it's an apple and an orange, we're going to keep two districts for that. Does that make sense? That's what we think about when we talk about consolidation of districts. So for agricultural, we really think you could do all those 6 districts in 2 districts. I'm not going to count all of the residential districts, but look at how many residential districts there are. We think you could really do this in 4. So an N1, an N2, an N3, and then a neighborhood village residential. You also have a number of mixed-use districts. That's great. We like mixed-use districts, but you have a lot. We think that we could have less mixed-use districts as well, and we're going to propose probably 4. Overall, there are more than 40 districts in your code. I think we are proposing we could possibly reduce that to 16. And that's what we mean when we say clarifying, creating clarity and ease of use. We want to understand the purpose of these districts and create districts that function within a logical framework. So, we know that there are districts like the floodplain district and the airport district that really don't have a comparable district, and those will be continued. And we also think that your industrial districts, 6 of them, we think that really you could do with an I1 and an I2, or a general and a light industrial. So that is our presentation. I went through the last little bit pretty quick, but we do want to get to the discussion portion of the evening. And we went a little long. I apologize. I would like to take some questions before we do the discussion. And I'm going to say let's limit it to 10 minutes of questions so that we can talk more informally. Let me ask though, are there folks here tonight that would like to ask questions or have questions that you think it would be beneficial for your friends and neighbors to hear? Because the alternative is for you just to talk to us directly and mill about a little bit. And so raise your hand if right now you're thinking you have a question and it would be beneficial for everyone to hear that question and everyone to hear our response. Does anyone have questions they've been waiting to ask? Oh, well, all right. I'm actually not seeing a desire to do a Q&A, and I think that's fine. This is your meeting. We do appreciate and hope that you stick around to have some discussion with us. And here's the fun part. The big map on the table over there, we call that the kitchen table. And our hope is that you'll come kind of talk with us over there. It is a map of the entire town. You can find your house on it. You can find places you want us to learn about. And we want you to put sticky notes down there and help us learn the community from your perspective. Also, if you came here tonight about a specific issue, something that you would like to see fixed, something that's important to your neighborhood or your business, that's where we have some Post-its back there on the what's your big idea for Zionsville. Please take time to write some comments for us. We will consider these numero uno as we work on our drafts. We'll look through every comment we receive tonight. We also, as I mentioned, have a website. That website has an open comment box on it. You can go and submit your comments on the website too. But you're here, and you can submit them twice too, but we would really appreciate it if you would write down some comments for us this evening. We also, let me finish my description. We will take a question. We also over here have some of the existing town planning documents at the circular table. And we've got something there called a mental mapping exercise. What we mean, and particularly in the village, I think it would be interesting, is if you could draw a map of your perspective. What are the landmarks that are important to you? How do you get there? Where are the parks that you visit? What are the places that you think most define this community? If you could draw a map of how you think the community goes, that helps us understand really your perceptions and how you think about this place and what's important to you in this place. I think that's most of what we have for the rest of the evening. We do hope you stick around and have some discussions with us. And thank you, but I am going to take a couple questions. We had a few folks change their mind, and that's great.
No, your website has your comment. I didn't catch the website.
Thank you. It is ZionsvilleTownCode.com. ZionsvilleTownCode.com. And thank you, yeah, and up there right now, it's really just the schedule for what we're doing this week. We're gonna be posting these presentations up there. We've also videotaped the presentation, so if anyone wants to review anything that's happened on the other nights, those videos, we'll be working to post them on that website. We'll also be working with the town to get it on the town's webpage. Was there another question? No, okay. All right, well, thank you, appreciate it. Let's have some discussion, and again, we appreciate your time, thank you.